I've resisted the urge to talk about bad movies for a long time, both because I think it's a gimmick that's overplayed, but also because some prominent voices that I really enjoy on this very platform do that very well. But there's one film I saw a few years back now that stuck with me for a bunch of conflicting reasons that I want to discuss today. That film is 2019's Ad Astra, directed by critical darling James Gray and starring Brad Pitt in the leading role. And if you recall this movie but haven't seen it, you've probably mentally boiled it down to the Brad Pitt astronaut movie, and yeah, that's the one. Not the Ryan Gosling space movie or the older George Clooney one, both of which share some minor thematic or visual similarities. The film is considered by some to be a diamond in the rough, one of the more meditative, thoughtful, big-scale films of the modern era. Yet despite that pedigree and a good critical reception, there's a glaring negative user review score on Rotten Tomatoes. Not that that's really a good way to gauge anything, but I think there's some merit to the passé reaction the film received from the general public. Specifically, the movie wasn't marketed as, I don't know if I'd say an action film, but as something more explosive and kinetic, perhaps, than the somber, contemplative character study the film turns out to be. And yes, there are some incredible moments that have held up, even if it's only been a few years, but it doesn't lean into those aspects the same way that, say, 2013's Gravity does. In this regard, the film's slow, deliberate pacing and focus on character and visual storytelling over action beats places it more along the lines of Solora, First Man, or even the first half of Interstellar. It's a sad spaceman movie with a few moments of brief action interspersed over a 2-hour runtime. When I first saw the movie, I went with 2 friends, and as we walked out, I asked the question you always ask your friends after a movie. What did you think? Did you like it? To which both friends paused before ultimately replying, yeah, with that upward inflection that indicates a caveat is coming. But, they both elaborated, it was kind of boring. Very pretty to look at and exceedingly well crafted, but save for one really, really out of left field moment, it was kind of boring. So, what is the Brad Pitt astronaut movie about? Short version is that Brad Pitt is the son of a famous astronaut explorer who has disappeared, probably dead, exploring deep space for other life in the universe. That father, played by Tommy Lee Jones, is a character that receives a great deal of importance to the story and gravitas over the narrative without ever actually being present in it during the early scenes. Ad Astra is, initially, a story about a son going to find his father, but also a story about a son trying to live up to his father's legacy. Good, classic film stuff. Not too complicated, so far so good. As astronaut Brad Pitt ventures out into space to find Daddy Lee Jones, he leaves his, shall we say, love interest, played by Liv Tyler, behind, making her the only actress I can think of to be consistently playing the role of abandoned space wife. The film makes a point of letting us know early on that she's special, and he might be making a mistake. Brad Pitt is ignoring the beauty and the wonder of life right in front of him, living here on Earth, to seemingly go find the same thing elsewhere? Big, don't overlook what you've got narrative energy going on here in regards to her character, which is critical when it comes to understanding how this movie comes together and also falls apart later on. Anyways, Brad Pitt is off in space, and as he spends some time on the moon learning more about his famous explorer father's final mission. Maybe he's alive, it sounds like? It's a movie, that tracks. But more nefarious details begin to surface, that Daddy Lee Jones has gone rogue, perhaps even taken over the ship in his zeal to go beyond the mission, searching even further out into deep space. What becomes clear is that Space Lee Jones isn't the hero we were initially told, but more of a villain, a zealot, who endangered, even killed his crew in his pursuits. The fact that Tommy Lee Jones killed astronauts to keep the mission going is treated by the movie as a big state-level conspiracy. And the more prominent, positive narrative around his character is essentially just played up as propaganda. And for the record, before you think I'm spoiling anything, all of this is more or less plainly stated in the trailers.
I'm attempting to reach Dr. Clifford McBride.
We believe your father may be involved.
My father's dead. What exactly are you requiring from me?
So far, all this is good. A little low-key perhaps, but good. There's a very distinct moment when it all comes off the rails though. See, the film has told us what it's about by now. People are more important than conquest. And so far, we've seen astronaut Brad Pitt repeat the first sin of the father. Tommy Lee Jones abandoned young Brad Pitt, and now Brad Pitt has abandoned Liv Tyler, much in the same way. Good, great, that all checks out. But then something happens that undercuts this angle somewhat jarringly. About halfway through the film, astronaut Brad Pitt essentially sneaks his way onto a space shuttle. How he manages to get from the exterior into the interior of the ship is a logical gap that sticks out like a sore thumb in such a deeply considered film that seems to care so intensely about such details, but that aspect is immediately drowned out by what happens next. Discovered on board, astronaut Brad Pitt resists capture and winds up killing both of the other astronauts on board, essentially pirating the spaceship. And for a moment, it feels like this is going to be a big emotional moment in the film. Brad Pitt learned about how evil and terrible it was that his father murdered people in pursuit of extra life in the galaxy, and even proceeds to follow him by manslaughtering astronauts to follow him deeper into space. But the film never, ever brings this point up, or seems to point out the resonance within the narrative. In fact, for a film with such heavy emotionality built into it, the moment is moved on from with little fanfare surprisingly quickly. Maybe it's just my bias that the film didn't adhere to the narrative I had in mind when it was set up in front of me, and maybe I'm being unfair. But on rewatching this film, it really seems like the point the film is trying to make, one of many thematic echoes in the narrative, but it doesn't, isn't? It's treated more like a tragic accident, just one speed bump on the road of this insane journey that Brad Pitt is on. The scene's lack of resonance kicks way back in at the very end of the film when, okay, now this is actual spoilers, Brad Pitt makes it back to Earth and more importantly, back to Liv Tyler. The film kinda ends by saying, see, he got it, he figured it out. He figured out that what he was searching for was on Earth all along, right? Happy ending. Yeah, but also, he's like a criminal? I turned to my friend at the end of the movie during this scene and I asked, so, is he getting arrested for killing all those people? Tommy Lee Jones being a space pirate that murdered other astronauts is so central to the plot, with the consequences of his absence on his son being essentially the initial plot driver, and his character being the bad guy as a major reframing for the resolution. It's treated as a deep state conspiracy secret that all of this happened, and you're telling me that astronaut Brad Pitt murdered 2 astronauts and commandeered a NASA deep space rocket so he could fly after his space pirate father, and there isn't going to be any resolution for any of that? No consequences? Brad Pitt doesn't go down as some kind of space outlaw legend at all. He gets off scot-free and goes back to his life like nothing ever happened? What the actual fuck? And about that ending. Most of the final third of the film is Brad Pitt doing increasingly unlikely space stunts to get his way to the missing spaceship where, surprise, Daddy Lee Jones has gone rogue and the crew is dead and he's an asshole, and astronaut Brad Pitt realizes that this was a terrible idea and makes his way back to Earth on a flying locker door. Again, no spoilers, it's in the trailer. Which is admittedly much more dramatic and long-winded than I just summarized, but it's essentially the case. And if I'm going to get grief for this video, it's going to be that people are going to say I didn't give the ending enough credit for how it wraps up the stories that it does seem to want to tell. It's a story about fathers and sons, not sons going to prison for manslaughter and spaceship theft? Mutineering? Something. And that's fair, I guess. But for me, what makes this film so fascinating is how much it builds up this emotionality, this core concept of people over conquest, and then completely forgets to hold its main character accountable. The film's visual design and costumes and sets are so immaculate and intricately detailed that it feels strange with how obviously considered every other aspect of the film is. I'd also be remiss not to mention the Space Monkey scene. Yes, indeed, the one moment during the movie where the entire theater was truly captivated was when more than an hour into the film, what has so far been an exceedingly slow burn suddenly turns into something much more exciting that features ravenous, human-eating space monkeys. The whole scene plays out like a mini horror film that was stuck squarely in the middle of the movie, and it contrasts both in tone and style with the rest of the film, particularly because it's the most obvious use of CGI. There's also a gunfight on the moon, which is honestly the highlight of the whole film in terms of blending the unique style and visual grounding with something more interesting than Brad Pitt just being sad. It's kind of a huge bummer, honestly, that so much of that particular scene made its way into the trailers, because it would have, other than the face-eating monkeys, been the biggest surprise and the biggest hook of the entire film. So clearly Ad Astra has stuck with me more than I ever expected it to. Not entirely for good reasons, but not necessarily because I don't like it either. There's so much good here. The acting, the set design, the cinematography, the lighting, but man, that one brutal murder scene stands out to me as a single defining thing about the film. You know, other than Brad Pitt as an astronaut. And I don't think Ad Astra is destined to be an underrated gem or some kind of modern classic, but I do think it's fascinating to watch in a very specific, disjointed way that makes it feel truly unique. I don't think it's great, but it has so many elements to be great. It reminds me a bit of Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049, which is arguably the closest proxy to Ad Astra in terms of pacing, spectacle, and ultimately box office performance, or I guess underperformance. While I wrote this script, I got to watch Dune, which really feels like something pretty special from Villeneuve, and I am very glad about that. I still think his best movie is Sicario, which is one of the great all-time modern films, but he's on a pretty incredible run, and I'm obviously excited to see what they do with Part 2, which, go figure, was announced this morning. I hope there are some big Ad Astra fans out there who just really dig this movie, and in several ways, I do think it is very cool. Again, visually breathtaking, and the dedication to the technological detail, even just as pure concept, feels grounded and authentic aesthetically. It's eye candy, but it's a little boring and a little silly, and I kind of like it, but it drove me crazy enough to write 2,000 words about astronaut Brad Pitt, so